Recently, I finished my last narration of a long phone trip through the Carolinas. And prior to that, I was able to finish up a narration of another long phone trip through the Mid-Atlantic, primarily Virginia and Pennsylvania. I'm really happy that you can listen to these programs and see what it was like to go from one environment to the other. The old phone network had amazing variation. Now, those phone trips were primarily focused on independent telephone companies because they varied more than the Bell system phone companies did, at least if you were going town to town. But the Bell system was more interesting in big cities, such as New York City. And so, in the spirit of a phone trip, although it won't exactly be that, it's more of a tour, welcome to the Bronx. Obviously a very different place from the Carolinas.
Thank you.
The Bronx is one of the 5 boroughs of New York City, and in the 1970s, yeah, there was a lot of arson going on and a lot of gang activity. But fortunately for the tape collection, Ben and I were like 19 years old, and we did not think we would die. So we did go to the Bronx, and we were fortunate. The worst thing that ever happened was I had a glass bottle thrown down at me from an elevated subway platform while I was recording 892. A really cool sounding Crossbar 1 that would sometimes have MF crosstalk on the originating register senders, and meanwhile the local reorder tone was made with 2 city ring low tones together. Ow. Anyway, let's start not with 892, but in the center of the Bronx, telephonically, a building known as Grand Concourse. It's located on Grand Concourse around 175th Street, and it's the home to the long-distance tandems Bronx 1 and 2,
21224.
as well as local tandems Tremont 1 and 2.
21226.
There was quite possibly also a small panel office selector tandem in that building in the early 70s. There's a panel office in this building that we have extensive recordings of, and it sounds great. That'll be the next stop on this tour, but this program will concentrate on the number 1 Crossbar. In the 1970s, it has 4 office codes, 294 and 731. Then there's also 299 and 583. 731 doesn't have letters. The 29s, I believe, are Cyprus. And 583 is LU. I don't know the name, but there's another LU in the Bronx that was Ludlow. Now, the panel sounds great. The Crossbar 1, however, well, let's just say that it exemplifies a problem that runs through this entire building: noisy power supplies. Now, in the downstate New York area, 550 is reserved as a ringback code. But if you're calling from a Crossbar 1, it's never the right ringback code. So if you dial 550 from any number 1 Crossbar, you're going to get the local reorder tone, which is appropriate when you dial a wrong ringback code. Here's dialing 550 from a 294 dial tone first coin phone, and you can hear what it is about noisy power supplies in this office. See what I mean? That sound pretty much gets into everything from 294. The panel in this building has that same sound, but it's at a lower level. Here, however, you could legitimately ask, what is more intrusive, this or this? I know the old telephone network pretty well, and I gotta tell you, this is a bit much. I try to feel better about it by imagining it's a string section in an orchestra. If it could just play a different note every now and then. Yeah, that would be nice, but it only plays one note. And that note that it plays isn't even on a musical pitch. Because of that sound, I have already begun seriously turning down the volume during the dialing portion of these calls. You'll hear me turn it down shortly after we break dial tone and turn it back up again, in most cases, right before the call starts to go through. On the next call, however, the vacant code recording is so loud that I keep the volume down for that. And from here out, in this program, I'm also going to lower the volume during the coin return and post-coin return test process, this. Let's make some calls. Here's a call from 1978 where I dial a vacant code in area code 914, a local nearby area code. I dial it slowly. In addition to the screaming, yeah, that, you can hear the Spanish portion of the local overtime recording.
I'm sorry. We're unable to complete your call as dialed. Please check the number and dial again or ask your operator for assistance. This is a recording.
That was a new centralized vacant code recording that turned up in the Bronx in 1978 with announcer Jane Barbie. And thanks to the fact that Autochron created that entire recording arrangement, including the trunks that deliver it to individual callers, this busy signal is talkable. In fact, if you listen with headphones, you can hear music leaking through it, probably from someone's music on hold. And as you also heard, the Bronx Symphony Orchestra got into it as well. It pretty much gets into everything. But the 1978 Autochron arrangement is too late in the telephone history to even matter to Ben and me. Prior to this time, the vacant codes from local Crossbar 1 and panel offices all over the Bronx were handled by borrowing the recording from Bronx Tandems 1 and 2. I remember Bill Acker used to tell me that at the blind school in the Bronx that he went to, served by the Kruger Avenue office, 882-9696 was the telephone number of the payphone there.
Hasn't Derek called us up at the school before? Because I know his voice sounds very familiar.
Yes, he has.
Ah, then I have spoken to him then.
Uh-huh. Did you pick up the 9696 sometime?
Right.
From that payphone, as well as all Crossbar 1 payphones in the Bronx, Bill would get,
I'm sorry. We are unable to complete your call as dialed. Please check the number and dial again or ask your operator for assistance. This is a recording. To 1224. I'm sorry.
Ben and I didn't record the local vacant code here in Grand Concourse during the time the Bronx Tandem recording had the Owen Murphy voice.
I'm sorry.
But we did get one in 1977 when the voice and text had changed, and in this example, the Bronx Symphony Orchestra is especially severe.
We're sorry, but we have a problem in completing your call as dialed. Please check the number and dial again or ask your operator to help you. This is a recording.
21224. We're sorry, but we have a problem in completing your call as dialed. Please check the number and dial again, or ask your operator to help you. This is a recording.
21224.
We're sorry, but we have...
We never recorded a complete preservation study from this particular Crossbar 1 office in Grand Concourse, but it's probably just as well that the time was spent with other offices, because here, this is so loud that you can't hear many details of the register senders anyway. However, I can use the tapes we did record to show you some of the major tandem switch offices that we were constantly having calls go through as we dialed around New York City. In telephony, a tandem is a switching entity that is used to connect one office to another in cases where dedicated trunks between those two offices either don't exist or are all busy. When it comes to calls within a metropolitan area like New York, for example, calls made from this Crossbar 1 in the Bronx, there will be direct trunks to other Crossbar 1s, panels, Crossbar 5s, and ESSs in the Bronx, Manhattan, Queens, and Brooklyn, as well as southern Westchester County in the 914 area, wherever the traffic is sufficient to justify having direct trunks. But whenever those trunks get busy, that's when the call has to go through a tandem. Also, there are less frequently called end offices, such as a small Crossbar 5 in Brooklyn and all of the end offices on Staten Island, where the first choice will be a tandem. So knowing the network of New York City is knowing about the tandems of New York City. Now, probably the most important tandem in New York City's local network up through the early 1970s was a machine called Suburban Tandem. It was located in the 2nd Avenue building at East 13th Street, Manhattan. This was the building that had a serious fire in February 1975. And before the fire, Suburban Tandem was there, although during 1974 they were starting to retire it. The switch type was Panel Sender Tandem. This is a version of the panel switching system that, instead of giving dial tones and ringing customers, connects incoming trunks from various offices to outgoing trunks to various offices. And I can really say that this was the backbone of the New York City network for a long time. If you're calling any other borough and the other pathways are not available, you'll end up going through Suburban Tandem. That's true if you're calling from any panel and any Crossbar 1 in the city. In the 1960s, the Crossbar 5s also did use Suburban, but by the 70s, the Crossbar 5s had been switched to a newer layer of the New York City network called the sector tandems. Here's a call through Suburban to a Crossbar 5 in Corona, Queens. When we dial the first 3 digits, our Cypress 4 Crossbar 1 will select the trunk to Suburban Tandem, but not send any digits yet. Once we've dialed the 7th digit, the number will be sent using PCI, Panel Call Indicator Pulsing. This is an ancient protocol that was used back in the days of manual offices and later was adapted to communicate from end offices to tandems. So this Crossbar 1 is an example of an end office that uses PCI to communicate to several tandems. There are also some cases where PCI is used to communicate between tandems. PCI is a system that works only over wire trunks because they never translated it to work over carrier. It conveys the number using 4 pulses per digit, and then at the very end it sends a final pulse that says the number is completed. That final pulse is actually very important for something I'll mention in a little bit. But in the meantime, here's the first call through Suburban. Now, because of that, you can't really hear what our Cypress 4 Crossbar 1 is doing when it communicates to Suburban. But once we're on the Suburban trunk, you can hear all the details of what Suburban is doing.
I'm sorry. The number you have reached is not in service or temporarily disconnected. The number you have reached is not in service at this time. This is a recording.
What number you calling?
271-3247.
3247?
Right.
It's a working number, dial again.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Once the PCI is completed, the register sender in Cypress 4 drops out, and we're on the Suburban trunk. Now, the way the panel switching system connects you to an outgoing trunk is by advancing in a linear fashion through two selectors. That's done by a revertive pulse conversation between the selectors and the sender. And on a call like this, we do hear the tail end of that conversation. That part sounds like this. From other tapes, you may recognize that as the kind of revertive pulsing that you hear within a panel office. Shortly after the trunk is selected, the revertive pulse conversation between Corona and Suburban Tandem begins. And of course, because Corona is a Crossbar 5, the revertive pulsing sounds different, like this. And when that's complete, the Suburban Tandem sender drops out, and we're on the Corona trunk. Since Corona is a Crossbar office, the revertive pulsing was just to convey the number. The actual connection is made by one of the markers in Corona, which very quickly connects us to the line we're calling, which happens to be one of the intercept lines.
I'm sorry. The number you have reached is not in service.
Let's call GE4 a panel in Brooklyn's Kenmore Place building. This goes through the same way. The only difference is that the second set of revertive pulsing sounds like we're going through a panel office, and that is actually moving the switches rather than just conveying the number. As I said, Suburban Tandem is the backbone of the network because it's the final route for calling the rest of New York City. If all the other trunks are busy, including trunks to the other tandems, you'll end up going through Suburban. Now that's true of all the New York City Crossbar 1s in the early 1970s. Meanwhile, panel offices don't have alternate routing capability. Therefore, they don't have multiple choices for how to route a call. It's got to go to the same trunk group regardless of whether it's busy hour or the middle of the night. Thus, for panel offices, Suburban Tandem isn't the final route, but it is the default. If there isn't a better place to send it, panel offices will end up using Suburban. Now from coin phones, Suburban takes on even a greater role, because Suburban Tandem is the only switching point from Crossbar 1s and panels that can be used for the coin zone function. Coin zone is what they use when you make a local call beyond 15 miles, and the cost of the call is more than 10 cents. For example, if we call my home office in Lynbrook, Long Island, that is between 15 and 20 miles away. From a home phone, that is what is called a 3-message unit call. Message units were originally 5 cents each, and so it costs 15 cents for the first 5 minutes. Coin phone rates closely mirrored the message unit rates, at least originally. But then in the 1970s, well, message units went to 5.5 cents, and then 6 3/4, and then 7.1, and then 8.2, and it got kind of messy. In the early 70s, the original coin phone rates were still in effect, and so this was a 15-cent call from a coin phone, 16.5 cents from home. Here's a call to Lynbrook 9, the Crossbar 1 office that served my Long Island home, to a number that goes to the original Hempstead AIS, with its extremely high-quality voice announcements coming through kind of a noisy connection. When we dial 516, the area code for Long Island, followed by Lynbrook 9, our Cypress 4 Crossbar 1 will pick up a special coin zone trunk to Suburban Tandem. This trunk is different because it has extra relays to bring in an operator from the local cord board. When we dial the last digit of the number, Cypress 4 will PCI the number to Suburban Tandem, but it's going to hold off on that final pulse that says the number is complete. When the operator answers, she will ask for the additional deposit, 5 cents in this case, and when she hears that I've put it in, she will pull her cord, the call will drop off the operator's board, and then a relay in the trunk circuit will send that final PCI pulse that says the number is completed. That will tell Suburban Tandem that it can put the call the rest of the way through, and we will be on the trunk, hearing the outpulsing to the destination office.
Please. Thank you.
The number you have reached, 599-1835, has been changed. The new number is 461-0181 in New Jersey, in the 201 area. Please make a note of it. 599-1835 has been changed. The new number is 461-0181 in New Jersey, in the 201 area. If you need assistance, you may stay on the line, and an operator will answer.
Why was that connection so noisy? The answer: poor design of an old trunk circuit that was installed a lot, sometime probably in the 50s or the 60s, where revertive pulsing is being sent over carrier. To send revertive pulsing over carrier, they had to use a special signaling tone, 2 kilohertz. The only time that tone is actually used is during the setup of the call. Thus, while we were hearing this, which just sounds like clicks to us, on the trunk itself, there were bleeps of 2000 hertz coming back very loudly from Lynbrook to Suburban Tandem. The 2000 hertz oscillator is only used during the pulsing process. Everything else is handled using 2600 hertz. But the trunk circuits have a design flaw where whenever the trunk is on hook, that is, while the phone is ringing, or while you're talking to intercept, or while you're listening to a busy signal, the 2000 hertz oscillator just leaks through, and that makes this totally unnecessary sound. The 2000 hertz oscillator is leaking through, so that tone is on the line, and there's an overtone because 2600 is also being sent. The 2600 is filtered out, but the difference between the 2600 we don't hear and the 2000 we do hear is 600 hertz, and that's why this overtone is here. And then, for some reason that I can't explain, there is also a 1700 hertz component. Ay. Now, for a telephone enthusiast, it's nice to hear background noises that are just a part of the network, but this is more than a bit much. Now, fortunately, when the call actually answers, this mess of tones goes away. Thus, had we called Jane personally at a number in Lynbrook, Long Island, instead of hearing her on AIS like this,
The number you have reached,
it would have been like this. much better. But since most of the calls we make on these preservation tapes are non-completed, these trunks, well, bless them because they're all analog, they're still kind of unpleasant. Now, from this part of New York City, most of the coin zone calls you can make do go out on this kind of trunk. It's just because we're in New York City Zone 3, which is pretty central, and anything that's 15 to 30 miles from here is in that mileage range from Suburban Tandem, where the N carrier with revertive pulsing was used. Fortunately, I can show you a case where it doesn't go over one of these noisy trunks, because there is an office code in Long Island, Curtis 5, which serves a part of Valley Stream, Long Island that's very close to the New York City border. Curtis 5, even though it serves Long Island, is actually coming out of the Laurelton, Queens central office. Laurelton is close enough in that Suburban Tandem has cable pair trunks to it, so we don't go over the 2600 controlled N carrier with the 2000 Hz RP beeping. Instead, we just get a wire trunk and it sounds a lot nicer. Here's a call to Curtis 5 serving Valley Stream, and the central office we're reaching is actually in Laurelton, Queens.
Additional, please.
5 additional.
All right.
Okay, just a moment.
Right. Thank you.
Well, at long last, on that last call we actually got to hear some sounds indicating that our Cypress 4 Crossbar 1 was sending PCI. Here's what we heard, starting with the last digit dialed. Well, some sound. Let me filter out the Bronx symphony here, and maybe you can hear it's kind of a subtle shaking or rattling or clicking noise. There you go. There's actually something going on underneath the string section. God, New York is a noisy... Never mind. On CoinZone calls via Suburban Tandem, some of Suburban Tandem's activity is hidden from view. The setting up of panel selectors, which is audible on 10-cent calls, is not audible on CoinZone calls because that's happening while we are waiting for the operator and talking to the operator. By the time she's answered and we put in the money and she pulls a cord, that's already happened. But we do hear the second part. Here's another CoinZone call that's pretty far out, but doesn't use one of those trunks that has the leakage from the revertive pulse oscillator. And the reason is that on this trunk, Suburban dial pulses to the destination Crossbar 5 office, which is in Massapequa, Long Island. Now, dial pulsing into a Crossbar 5 is not so strange in the country as a whole, but in a revertive pulse environment, like the New York City area, dial pulsing into a Crossbar 5 is very odd. In fact, when I told Bill about this, his reaction was,
No.
but it's true. So here's a CoinZone call to Massapequa, Long Island. It is a 5-message unit call that's 15 cents additional, and after the operator pulls her cord, you'll hear Suburban Tandem dial pulsing the last 5 digits into Massapequa.
15 cents additional, please.
Could you return my dime and I'll put in a quarter?
Thank you.
While I was standing there at the payphone, I heard the dial pulse, but I didn't hear why it was happening. It wasn't until I got home and began to copy those recordings onto the Group Bell Master, which was the open reel tape, that I heard a detail, which I'd missed standing at the payphone, that explains why Suburban is dial pulsing to Massapequa in spite of the fact that it's very much in the New York downstate area. Those of you who know the tapes will hear something here. I'm going to play the part where the dial pulsing is about to end. Notice the trunk noise when we cut through to Massapequa and it starts to ring. Okay, here's the trunk noise emphasized. Oh boy, the Bronx Symphony Orchestra is making it hard to discern. Let me filter that out. Okay, it's still a little hard to hear, but that's N1 carrier coming out of Suburban Tandem going to Massapequa. And this is what showed us that N1 carrier apparently was never designed to revert of pulse. So if you're going to send a call over N1 carrier, you've got MF and dial pulse. Those are the only choices, but Suburban cannot MF. So it's dial pulse or nothing. And that means Massapequa is going to need dial pulse incoming registers exclusively for calls coming through Suburban because they wanted to use N1 carrier, and that's the only way to do it. Suburban Tandem is a panel switching system. It has a sender, but it cannot alternate route. That means that it has to have enough trunks to every office that is called through it to be able to satisfactorily handle the busy hour demand. That's called having a full group or full groups, no alternate route. Suburban Tandem has full groups to every panel, number 1 crossbar, number 5 crossbar, and number 1 ESS in New York City, Nassau County, including the Suffolk border zones, and southern Westchester County. In other words, it has direct trunks to everything that is a regular central office in the downstate area. This thing is huge. But there are other parts of the network that are, let's just say, non-regular, especially the part that makes sounds like this.
Hello, is anybody on?
Jay,
What?
when you get back on, what line you get on?
Whatever I can get on.
This is Hunter College. The number you have reached is not in service. If you are calling from within the college, please dial.
If you are in the company,
Hello?
dial O for the operator. Thank you for your cooperation.
Hello. This is Bruce. I'm sorry, we have our wires crossed.
This is a New York Life Insurance Company recorded in a...
That is a montage of sounds from a part of the network called Centrex CU, and before I knew the name, I referred to it as sub-exchanges. Businesses, government organizations, hospitals, etc. had private telephone systems furnished by the phone company with equipment on their premises, allowing them to dial between any two desks, usually using just 4 digits. This was a way to get a lot of phones in the building without having to get a separate, full-fledged, outside world phone line for every desk. But it was still possible to make outside calls. For this purpose, the phone company would provide a certain number of what were called trunk lines. That number would be much smaller than the actual number of telephones in the organization. The trunk lines were full-fledged outside lines, but they were shared among all the telephones in the organization. Outside calls were made by dialing a 9, waiting for a second dial tone, and then dialing the local number as usual. Now, before Centrex, the incoming calls to the company came through on those same trunk lines, which were answered by a live operator who would connect the caller to the particular desk. Well, Centrex eliminated the need for the operator on most incoming calls. The 4-digit extension number that was used within the company became the last 4 digits of a regular New York City telephone number. The trunk lines were used only for outgoing calls. Meanwhile, there were dial pulse trunks coming in through which the outside world network could directly control the PBX. Now, in New York City, along with other northern urban places like Washington, D.C., certain office codes, instead of being associated with a crossbar or a panel office, would be associated with a crossbar tandem. In Washington, D.C., the tandem that did this is called Washington PBX, with its recording ID
2028.
Crossbar tandems usually do not act as an end office, but in this case they sort of do. An office code like the famous 780, for example, instead of being associated with some crossbar office or a panel, would go to a crossbar tandem, and then the crossbar tandem would decide, based on the next digits dialed, which private telephone system to route the call to. I discovered this early on when I found that certain groups in 780 would ring like this, and others would ring like that. Well, there's a crossbar tandem deciding what goes where. Now, Suburban, being the final route for New York City, has to be able to handle these Centrex CU office codes. How does it do it? Well, we'll get to 780 in the next program. But first, let's talk about the majority of Centrex CU office codes in New York City, the ones in Manhattan. Manhattan, amazingly, has 5 distinct crossbar tandems dedicated almost exclusively to Centrex CU. Ben and I and telephone company people refer to these as the Centrex tandems or the DID tandems, direct inward dialing. One of these is Amsterdam Tandem 2 in the East 37th Street building.
I'm sorry. Your call did not go through. Will you please hang up and try again?
Recording 21219.
Amsterdam 2, along with the other 4 Manhattan DID tandems, can receive PCI, and Suburban can send PCI. So, when the direct trunks to Amsterdam 2, which we usually get from here, are busy, this crossbar one in the Bronx will send the call to Suburban using PCI. Then Suburban will finish setting up the route through its own panel switches to the outgoing Amsterdam trunk. Then Suburban PCIs the 7-digit number to Amsterdam and cuts through. Now Amsterdam dials the last 4 digits into the Centrex, and it cuts through. Here's a call to the Centrex code 598 via Suburban to Amsterdam 2 to the destination Centrex. Manhattan Centrex code 558 is served by a different Centrex tandem, VZ Tandem 2, at 140 West Street.
2127.
Here is a non-working group in 558. This is one of the number groups that doesn't have a Centrex associated with it, called during a time when the direct VZ trunks from here are busy, so it goes through Suburban. Once VZ gets the number PCI'd from Suburban, it immediately puts us on the Manhattan Intercept trunk. We'll hear a classic West Street ring, followed by the classic Manhattan Intercept announcement. Because this is a 1974 call, we will then go to the AIS operator.
sorry. The number you have reached is not in service or temporarily disconnected. The number you have reached is not in service at this time. This is a recording. I'm sorry. The number you have reached is not in service or temporarily disconnected. The number you have reached is not in service at this time. This is a recording.
Hello, you calling? Hello?
Sometime in early '75, we discovered they had walked back their decision to put AIS operators at the end of that announcement. AIS was getting overwhelmed, and so they resurrected the original intercept room at West 50th Street. So you've seen how Suburban Tandem connects directly to end offices that are normal. We've seen how Suburban is used for coin zone. And for the 5 Centrex tandems in Manhattan, Suburban has full groups and it can PCI. Now, there are some Centrex codes in the outer boroughs and in Nassau County, Long Island, where PCI is just not going to do it. For example, 780 is served by King's Tandem in downtown Brooklyn.
21232.
King's Tandem can only receive MF, and Suburban Tandem can't send MF. So Suburban Tandem, which has to handle everything in the downstate area, must have some way to reach points that require incoming MF. How does it do it? The answer is surprising. I'll get to that in the next program. This program contains composites, which have been planned and thought about for about 45 years, and therefore are very accurate. However, if anyone wants to do a study on the sound of PCI, do not use the calls involving Suburban Tandem as a reference, because the PCI sounds used here do not numerically match the numbers dialed. Group Bell Master number 39, which contains a lot of PCI calls to VZ Tandem 2 and Amsterdam Tandem 2, would be a good place to go if anybody ever wants to do that.